Who would have thought that Julius Caesar, Napoleon, and Martin Luther King Jr. had something in common? Well, they all actually were positively inclined towards universal basic income, or UBI, or at least something akin to this concept. The idea of providing people with some form of basic income has been around far longer than most of us would think. In fact, in 46 BC, Julius Caesar gave each Roman citizen 100 denarii and leaving 75 denarii to each citizen after his assassination. Throughout the ages, this concept reappeared in various forms and under various names. Thomas Paine was one huge supporter of what he termed ground rent, arguing that every person, rich or poor, should receive the payments to prevent invidious distinctions. And Napoleon Bonaparte was even sympathetic to the idea, but never actually implemented it. In the 60s, the idea of basic income gained in popularity and entered the political mainstream, being endorsed by Martin Luther King Jr. In 1969, President Nixon even proposed a negative income tax, NIT, that was structurally very similar to UBI. However, the entire proposal was ultimately voted down. So before we jump in to talk about what the pros and cons of UBI are, let's talk about what exactly it is demanding. A universal basic income provides an equal payment to everyone in society, irrespective of their economic situation. It has the attraction of being simple and transparent, of avoiding the complexity of a traditional means-tested benefit system. Therefore, some of the huge bureaucracies which have formed around the welfare system would be minimized, saving that money to directly financially benefit people through UBI. That sounds great, doesn't it? Receiving money from the state just for existing? It's covering all your necessary expenses so that you can focus on the things that are truly important to you, like creating a YouTube channel about fun, interesting questions in business and economics. Well, welcome to Rebel Economics. We're happy to welcome you to a new episode. Today, we will talk about the pros and cons of universal basic income. The theory is that if basic living expenses are met by UBI, people have the opportunity to undergo training to get a better job instead of settling for a job they will end up hating. This would mean that the workforce would become more educated and achieve higher salaries. In return, the state could get more taxes from people, getting back at least some of the money from the people that was invested in them through UBI. A more motivated workforce would likely also be more productive, happier, and with that, healthier. Mental issues related to our job are becoming more and more common. A study shows that 2/3 of full-time employees say they have experienced burnout at some point in their careers. Of course, not all of that could be alleviated through UBI, but taking off the pressure of people to have to generate income and stay in an unfulfilling job with a boss that incessantly screams at you seems like a good place to start. Also, UBI could cushion the blow of unemployment, as automations and AI take over more and more tasks that once only humans could do. In the US alone, 4 million manufacturing jobs have been taken since 2000. Other sectors such as retail and deliveries are sure to be next. Technology is advancing rapidly to substitute workers with machines, leaving many people out of a job in an increasingly sparse job market. UBI would enable the unemployed to maintain a baseline standard of living between jobs. It could also subsidize income for lower-paying, socially beneficial jobs like elderly care and education. But one of the most important benefits thought to be associated with UBI is the alleviation of poverty. For one, it would combat what is known as the poverty trap, a common part of traditional welfare programs. Many existing welfare programs are criticized for keeping people below the poverty line. Often, if welfare recipients make too much, they lose their benefits, even if their income is still unequal to the cost of living. Some programs even require participants to have essentially zero assets in order to qualify. In effect, the programs kick in when people have hit rock bottom, rather than trying to prevent them from getting there in the first place. A universal basic income could serve as a supportive springboard rather than a chain to the welfare system. So, while all these pros sound great, we also have to be realistic about the costs of UBI. So let's also talk a little about how UBI could be financed. Even the most ardent supporters agree that it would be a vast sum the state would have to spend. Apart from the theory mentioned earlier, that people would have better paying jobs because they would be a more educated workforce, therefore providing more taxable income, there also are some other sources which could provide UBI with the financial resources necessary. Firstly, the current welfare system is quite expensive. Citizens need to prove that they require the government's help, meaning there are people who need to check it. In many countries, there are frequent check-ins that unemployed people have to go to, or pick up their monthly welfare check manually. That requires a large bureaucratic system to keep the current welfare in place. In return, with UBI, many of these processes would no longer be required, and the state could save money by reducing the bureaucracy and using that money on UBI instead. Apart from just minimizing bureaucracy, some also argue that with UBI, the state could save on other costs. With basic needs being met through UBI, they predict there to be less crime, therefore some of the money spent on police, prisons, and the judiciary could be saved. But if UBI is so great, then why don't we have it yet? Well, because these benefits are only one part of the story. There are also those who say that introducing UBI is utopian and will not provide the benefits promised. Providing UBI for every citizen will be incredibly expensive, and much of the state's money will go to households who really do not need UBI. But you cannot make universal basic income not universal, so that is simply part of the deal. That is why many say that it will not actually alleviate poverty, because it is not targeted at the most needy. This means either that it is very expensive, so the government has to cut expenditures elsewhere, therefore creating a trade-off effect, or if costs are contained, it provides only a very small level of income, which has little impact on poverty. Also, since a possible income stream for UBI is the cutting of some benefits, this may leave some people lacking. The current system is need-based, meaning that some people receive benefits, are entitled to more, because they might have larger expenditures, for example, people with disabilities. Therefore, some form of a welfare system would still have to be upheld, even if UBI were to be introduced. Another fear is that if taxes are used to fund UBI, they might be so high that it actually might disincentivize work. After all, if your basic needs are met, why should you work 40 hours a week if the state is just going to take half of it anyways? The fear of removing the incentive to work by introducing UBI also has other facets. They fear that introducing UBI will make it impossible to find labor for less favorable jobs. Many countries already experience a shortage in certain sectors, such as construction workers, nurses, and sanitary workers. They are very physically demanding jobs with wages that do not make up for the labor put in. However, if the salaries for these sectors get increased, then base living costs would increase, in turn requiring the UBI to increase as well, therefore causing inflation. A similar argument is that many people would stop working altogether. If their basic needs are met, then there is no incentive to offer your time in return for a wage. If you do not have to rely on a job to survive, why not just cash in and relax? That way, the state would not even be able to get taxes off of you, therefore further increasing the cost of UBI. Overall, it can be said that the long-term macroeconomic consequences of a universal basic income depend on how workers change their behavior in response to it. If some workers reduce the amount of work they were prepared to do, then we would expect that the universal basic income would result in lower levels of economic activity and employment. So let's talk more about how realistic the funding is. If every US citizen over 18 years would receive $1,000 per month as UBI, that would cost the US a whopping $2.8 trillion a year, relative to total federal government spending of $4 trillion. Approximately $300 billion to $500 billion of that funding could potentially come from existing welfare safety net programs, but the government would still have to raise significant new revenue. Beyond the fiscal issue, the question is, would UBI even work? Many countries have launched studies into this with varying results. Let's start with Alaska. Since 1982, all Alaskan residents have been entitled to a yearly cash dividend from the Alaska Permanent Fund. Studies show that this has little effect. While the results suggest that a universal and permanent cash transfer does not significantly decrease aggregate employment, it does increase the share of people employed part-time in the overall population by 1.8 percentage points. Other studies are more positive about the benefits that UBI can provide. a Canadian study found that their negative income tax pilot showed improvements in high school completion rates, reduced hospitalizations, and mental health. A Finnish study shows similar results to the two mentioned above. Recipients of the UBI scheme work the same amount as beneficiaries of traditional unemployment insurances, similar to the conclusion of the study in Alaska. This led to criticize the program for not increasing work effort. However, preliminary results also show that the basic income had numerous positive physical and mental health effects, similar to the results of the Finnish study. To really know if UBI one day might work, more studies need to be done and on a long-term basis, granting UBI to various people in different stages of their lives. One such an effort is done by the German UBI initiative, Mein Grundeinkommen. It is a crowd-funded NGO focused on promoting UBI, raffling off €1,000 per month to hundreds of German citizens. Over the course of time in which they receive the UBI, they are asked to fill out questionnaires in order to better understand the effects that UBI has on people's lives. In today's episode, we have seen why UBI is such a commonly discussed topic. For one, it sounds absolutely great in theory, like a dream come true for many of us. But there are still many questions to be answered, and much we do not yet know about the actual effects of nationwide UBI. The question of UBI is more than just purely economic considerations. It includes theories of human behavior and psychology just as well. It would have effects across multiple sectors, making it incredibly difficult to really know what its result would be. Have you ever thought about what you would do if you received UBI? Would you quit your job, go back to studying, learn a new trade, travel the world? What would your long-term plan be? Maybe you're lucky and you will become part of a program so you can try it out. I hope you enjoyed today's episode on the pros and cons of universal basic income. You might also enjoy our video on the 4-day workweek or whether corruption might actually be good for the economy. See you next week here on Rebel Economics.